Hello everybody, thank you again for joining me today as we dissect and discuss the new information, new developments in the story of One Piece. The 10th Titanic captain of the Blackbeard pirates has been officially revealed to be Aokiji Kuzan, and this is something that has pretty significant implications, not just for the story, but also for behind-the-scenes material. Because based off of what we learned this week, I think it's obvious now, and I'm going to be showing you evidence to support this, but I think it's obvious that somewhere along the way, Oda made a decision that ended up changing the story in a very important way, specifically in regards to the final member of the Straw Hat crew. Because think about this, from this week alone, I've already seen people throwing out comments about a potential EOS Sanji versus Aokiji fight. And 2 weeks ago, that wasn't even in the cards. That thought didn't exist in a lot of people's minds, and now it does. Now it's legitimately a possibility. And speaking of Sanji, I find it interesting that he's the only character in the color spread to be awake. And not only is he awake, but he also appears to be reading a book with questionable spelling. You can argue that the title of the book has a typo and the word should be read as cooking, yet I've also read people say that because of the crown on the spine, that the word is actually 2 words, and it should be read as COC King, which could be taken as a hint from Oda, implying that Sanji will be the next Straw Hat to awaken Conqueror's Haki. I also find it interesting that Oda decided to exclude the women from this color spread, so unless the 2 of them somehow got turned into chipmunks, no Nami or Robin this week. We start right where we left off, with the aftermath of Garp's galaxy impact on Hachinosu, and then Groose using the power of his clay fruit to cushion the landing of Garp's ship. Now in that scene, his devil fruit power is sort of behaving as if it were a paramecia, but last time it was also suspected that it could be a logia. So it's one of those sort of ambiguous fruits that is difficult to pinpoint its classification. As confirmed by Kobe, it turns out that Tashigi is not a member of Sword, and so that also heavily implies that Smoker is also not a member, unless of course he decided to join and recommended that Tashigi remain unaffiliated for her to protect her status as a Marine. And I found it so funny that out of nowhere, Hibari is the first one to get frozen by Kuzan. Like, he targets no one aside from her. So I was reading that and I was like, is that some kind of revenge freeze for the fight against Akainu? And so that specific action taken by Kuzan is definitely not helping the suspicion about Hibari and Akainu being related. More specifically, them being daughter and father. I appreciated getting a flashback to a point in time in the story that we know very little about, which is the 2-year gap during which the Straw Hats were training and working on themselves to enter the New World. Specifically, this comes after the fight in Punk Hazard. The scene appears to be set in a town with architecture that would make me think that I would run into some Smurfs there. And I like how, despite taking an L against Akainu, Aokiji is just really smooth throughout the entirety of the interaction. And I don't know if it was just me, but to me this whole scene, like the atmosphere and the interactions, like they just felt super relatable. Because I've done this before where you catch an L in life and you go over to a bar and you sit down with some scotch and you contemplate your life's choices, and then some strange individuals with some questionable goals and morals walk in, and they end up sitting next to you, and before you know it, you're exchanging stories with them. Now, given the 2 groups of Blackbeard pirates that we see, one in Hachinosu, the other one in Winter Island, by method of elimination, the Blackbeard pirate ship that we saw approaching Egghead has to be carrying Lafitte and Katarina Devon. Those are the only 2 Blackbeard pirates that would be available to go to Egghead, given that the rest of the group is split between Hachinosu and Winter Island. And though initially it might seem that Oda cuts away from Hachinosu while making it seem that Garp has the upper hand by pushing Aokiji into a hole with advanced COC, all things considered, I do think that Garp is going to find himself in a very tight spot in a difficult situation very soon. Because for one, Oda goes out of his way to remind us that Garp is no longer in his prime, that his strength and power has lessened over the years, even though it's still quite impressive. But then, in addition to Aokiji, there are some pretty strong dudes there. I think this chapter does a great job at making us forget that Shiryu is there as well, that Vasco Shot is there, that Avalo Pizarro is there, that San Juan Wolf is there as well. And even though we did learn that they're thinking about restraining themselves because they don't want to damage the island too much, at the end of the day, we all know that Blackbeard's crew knows how to jump a guy. Another thing too is like the way that Aokiji snuck up on Kobe and froze Hibari was on some pro-level stealth type of to the point where it made me wonder, like, was he hiding his presence, like Rayleigh said that he was doing when he was training Luffy? Because one of the things that Oda has made an effort to show is that even pre-time skip, like in Marineford, Kobe was showcasing some pretty significant observation haki feats. So the fact that Aokiji was able to bypass that observation haki and freeze Hibari without Kobe even noticing is pretty impressive. Also, because Aokiji trained under Garp, I would imagine that he would know how to defend himself against his attacks a lot better than most people. Plus, we've seen Aokiji take hits before and how he just uses his eyes to to reform and pop up again. Add to that the fact that at the very least, we know that he can use advanced armament hockey, and you can use advanced armament hockey as a barrier to protect yourself. So I think that even after Garp's attack, he should be all right, to some extent. And I say to some extent because if you look at the type of grip that Garp is using on Aokiji's face, it's very similar to the type of grip that Sabo used on Burgess back in Dressrosa. And we know how that ended up working out for Burgess, where he needed to reconstruct his face. So it would make sense that it's a similar grip, and maybe the grip got passed down from Garp to Dragon, and then from Dragon to Sabo. You also see a little click sound effect there coming out of Aokiji's jaw from the attack. So ultimately, he should be alright, but it's still quite a powerful attack. Something else we learned that's new this week is that the man marked by fire is in possession of the final and fourth road poneglyph. Now, because of the whirlpool ability that Lafitte mentions, a lot of fans are already speculating that perhaps the man marked by fire is Monkey D. Dragon. And I'm assuming that this idea is mainly based on the fact that we know that whenever Dragon shows up in the story, there's always a storm that precedes him. However, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think that the man marked by flames is actually Scopper. And not only that, but I also think that the black ship that Lafitte mentions that Scopper is on, I think that's actually the Otto Jackson. I think the exterior color of the ship was changed on purpose so that the ship wouldn't draw a lot of attention, and so that Scopper could go into hiding with the road poneglyph. And so because after Roger went to Laugh Tale, he learned that somebody would eventually show up in the future that would surpass him and his crew, I definitely think it's intentional that two of the former Roger pirates that we've seen are strategically located in sort of like the milestone areas of the Grand Line. Again, Crocus is sort of in the entrance at the Twin Capes after passing Reverse Mountain, and then Rayleigh is in the midpoint of the journey in Saboti Archipelago. Plus, if you think about it, both Crocus and Rayleigh give something to the Straw Hats that is pretty much a requirement, instrumental for them to get to the next place. Because Crocus gives them the log pose, and then Rayleigh actually coats the Sunny so that the ship can submerge and go to Fishman Island. Plus, Rayleigh ends up training Luffy, which was also sort of a requirement that needed to happen in order for Luffy to do well in the New World. So if we follow that pattern, it makes perfect sense for Scopper to be the third and final member of the Roger Pirates that the main characters have to run into in order to get to Laugh Tale. Now, Lafitte also says that he suspects that the man has a double fruit power, but I actually think that's a misdirect from Oda. Instead, what I really think is going on is that the creature, the animal, or the mythological beast or whatever that was in the egg that we know was aboard Roger's ship, that egg has now hatched, and I think the creature that was born out of it has the ability to create whirlpools. Now, given the stage of the game that we're in, which is like the final stage, right, there's a huge benefit to the explanation that I'm giving actually being true, because it allows Oda to answer 3 questions at once. So the famous ship that Tom built and was being incriminated for, the Otto Jackson, was sent into hiding and was given to Scopper Gabbin, who also happens to be the man marked by flames and is in possession of the final 4th road poneglyph, and the giant egg aboard Roger's ship has now hatched, and it's a creature that's capable of creating whirlpools that protect Scopper Gabbin as well as the Otto Jackson. Also, it might be the case that the creature in the egg was actually a descendant of whatever caused the whirlpools to exist outside of Wano to protect its borders. And just as a brief recap, because of Law's defeat in this chapter, it really does seem as if the actual race for the One Piece at this point is only between Shanks, Luffy, and Blackbeard, because they're the ones that have the most road poneglyphs currently collected. Unless Buggy continues to fail upwards and it turns out that Captain John's treasure actually is a stash of road poneglyph rubbings, he could get them that way thanks to the armband that Luffy gave him back in Impel Down that also functions as a treasure map. Also, Buggy reaching Laugh Tale at the same time as Shanks would serve to fulfill the foreshadowing from the Oden flashback where Shanks tells Roger that him and Buggy will go to Laugh Tale one day with their own crews. So it's more than likely that we'll end up running into Cross Guild at an intersection. And speaking of former Shichibukai, it turns out that the 100 hearts that Law took and offered to the government so that he could become a Shichibukai, those hearts were actually tied to the Rocky Port incident, which Law was credited as being the mastermind of. Thus, we can now say that the Rocky Port incident led to the following 3 things. It led to Teach taking over Pirate Island, making that his headquarters, it led to Law becoming a Chichibukai, and it also led to Kobe being recognized as a Marine hero. And speaking of Marines, just a quick note on 2 of them, specifically Kujaku, Suru's granddaughter, and Prince Groose. There's a scene in this chapter where Prince Groose says, "I can't believe Garp called Kobe the future of the Navy. That sucks. I'm gonna sabotage him." And then Kujaku says, "You're not supposed to say that part out loud. You sweet, sheltered child. Last week I noticed that some people were mentioning that Grus kind of looks a little bit like Rocinante. And we know that Rocinante's family, Doflamingo's family, were world nobles, right? They used to live up in Marijoa. And we also know that Suru was in charge of chasing Doflamingo all over the place. Like, she was really interested in capturing him specifically. And so here we have Suru's granddaughter calling somebody who's referred to as Prince Grus, calling them a sheltered child. So it gets me to wonder if Grus comes from a family of world nobles, or maybe from a kingdom, and maybe he was at one point royalty or something like that. And then of course we have Kujaku's hat, which I know people have noticed that it's very similar to Sengoku's hat. So what's the relationship there? Is there a relationship between Sengoku and Kujaku, and therefore could there be a connection between Sengoku and Suru as well? Okay, so now I could go ahead and talk about the change that I think this chapter confirms actually took place behind the scenes. Okay, so in chapter 737, that's where we learn that Blackbeard has 10 crewmates. And in this chapter, we are led to believe that Aokiji at that time was already part of the 10. However, if that were true, I find it very strange that nobody has pointed this out beforehand. Smoker doesn't point it out during his conversation with Kuzan in Punk Hazard. Like, he never says, like, hey Kuzan, I heard that you're a 10th Titanic captain under Blackbeard now. What's up with that? At one point, Doflamingo even mentions that Kuzan could be mistaken for a vagabond, that it would be normal and expected for people to just think that he's a man wandering around. And even after Dressrosa, the Gorosei say that they know that Kuzan is siding with Blackbeard, but there is no mention of him actually working under Blackbeard as the 10th Titanic captain. So why is that? I think the answer is due to a last-minute change in the story that Oda made by the end of Wano. I think that initially, the way it was supposed to go was that Blackbeard was supposed to have 10 captains, and then also have Aokiji as an additional ally, sort of as an extra. Because Oda decided that neither Yamato nor Carrot were going to join the crew officially, that ended up leaving him with only 10 Straw Hats total. Do you get where I'm going with this? So because there was no 11th Straw Hat, right? Because we didn't pick up a new member, if Blackbeard really had 10 crewmates in addition to himself, then Luffy would be one guy short, because Luffy would only have 9 against Blackbeard's 10. So I do think that initially there was supposed to be a 10th Titanic captain that was not Aokiji, but that had to change because Luffy did not pick up another crew member. And so what Oda did is that he moved Aokiji into that 10th slot that was being saved for somebody else. And so that's why Oda is able to get away with saying, like, oh, there is a 10th Titanic captain. So it's not like he's creating a plot hole for himself. It's not like he's not delivering on something that he promised, but he just says, but it's been Aokiji the whole time. Now, we may never know who it was that was supposed to be the 10th Titanic captain originally. That was lost in editing. And it kind of feels like when you're playing a video game and you walk into this very strange room that doesn't really serve a purpose, and then you later find out that it was left in the game because the developers were thinking about putting something in there, but they never did. And so they just released the game that way. That's kind of what it feels like. So a good question for the SBS would be to write in and say, hello, Oda-sensei, quick question. Was Aokiji always supposed to be the 10th Titanic captain of Blackbeard's crew? Was having him be that always the original plan? Because I really don't think it was. I'm going to show you 2 statements from Oda that were translated by Sandman that kind of support this. So the first one is Oda admitting that what he wants to do most in One Piece is character models, not story. He says that he feels the happiest when he's created a character silhouette that nobody's ever seen before. And then he also goes on to say that that's one of the reasons for why the story keeps getting longer and longer. And then in another statement, Oda said the following. He said, if I drew everything in my head that I wanted to draw during the Marineford War arc, each chapter would be at least 50 pages. So on one hand, he recognizes that he loves creating new characters so that he can reveal them to the readers. And on the other, he also understands that doing this actually stretches the series out more than it should be. Now, if you think about it, the elimination of the original 10th Titanic captain also happens to match perfectly with the real life timeline. Because last year, Oda took a 1-month break, and the reason he gave for taking this break is that he was going to make some final adjustments to the story so that it would end sooner rather than later. Now, if you remember what was going on before the break, The way the story was going was that, for the most part, I think a majority of us were convinced that Yamato is going to join the crew. We come back from the break, it turns out that Yamato doesn't join the crew officially, so I think that was one of the adjustments that Oda made, and because he ended up editing the final number of Straw Hat crewmates, he also ended up needing to make an edit to the final number of Blackbeard pirates, because the math for the final 1v1 matchups between both crews would not have added up. And I know you could say, well, with Aokiji joining, doesn't that mean that we're basically back in the same place with 11 Blackbeard pirates versus 10 Straw Hats? And I would honestly say no. I still think that it's going to be a 10v10 because I think that it's obvious that Kuzan is going to betray Blackbeard at some point. There's a dialogue in the official translation that makes it very clear. Kuzan says to Blackbeard, "Watch yourself. Just because we shared a few drinks doesn't mean that I trust any of the lot of you." And then conveniently, the flashback ends right when Blackbeard asks Aokiji, "What is it that you really want?" So we don't really know Aokiji's true motivation. There were moments in this chapter between Aokiji and Garp that to me definitely read like some type of Snape and Dumbledore situation, where Snape, in this case Aokiji, is pretending to work for Voldemort, and he's very convincing at letting that show, but in reality he's really working towards the goal of doing something that will eventually cause his demise. And there's a bit of dialogue where Garp tells Aokiji to live in the present moment, to forget the past, just focus on the present, almost like he's coaching him like, hey, stay in character. He also says like wavering is a sign of weakness, so don't hesitate, right? So again, he's kind of like, if you're going to put up a front, if that's what's going on behind the scenes, then, be convincing about it. Don't hesitate. Also, if the fight keeps going between him and Garp, I really hope that we get an answer as to what it was that Garp helped Aokiji with in the past. Because we know that Garp did Aokiji a pretty big favor in the past. We just don't know what it was. We get a beautifully drawn panel of the polar tang broken in half, sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And one of the things that I remember Oda taking some time to highlight was that one of the strengths of Law's crew is that it has members that are pretty good swimmers. And that's why MVP Beppo is able to tell Law not to worry about them and to focus on surviving first. And at the risk of sounding preachy, I found that sometimes in life we get frustrated because we don't get what we want at a specific time, but then we keep living and we move on, and that thing that we wanted actually does happen to us later on, and then we come to realize that the reason for why it didn't happen earlier was because it was going to happen at a better time. And that's literally how I feel about Beppo going Sulong form. I think a lot of us would have wanted this to happen in Wano, but it never did. The form never showed up there. But looking at this now, it's like, well, if Beppo had used the form back then he probably would have only used it to fight some random fodder. Whereas here, the reveal is used to move the story forward, and it serves a very, very important narrative purpose. Before Wano started, I had actually made a video discussing my expectations for each of the Straw Hats, and I do recall thinking that I thought that Chopper was going to go Sulong, that he was going to find a way of going Sulong. And I think his little flashback conversation with Beppo here kind of hints at the idea that had Chopper gotten a 1v1, a full 1v1 in Wano, that's probably what we would have ended up seeing. Another thing we learn is that Blackbeard is aware of the Eternal Youth surgery that could be performed via the Opi Opi no Mi, but he's actually conflicted about whether to do that or cash in the fruit for the 5 billion berries. So that gets me to think that maybe he does not know about the national treasure of Marijoa, because I think if he did, it would be a no-brainer. At least it was for Doflamingo. And so if that's the case, it does kind of get you to wonder, then why is it that he wants Pirate Island to be recognized by the world government so bad then? Finally, just going back to the main point of this video, which is to highlight one of the main editorial changes that took place in the story recently, which, by the way, I think it's important to mention that these apparent last-minute edits that take place are completely normal within the manga industry, especially if you're part of a weekly serialization, because you have to make tweaks and adjustments to meet deadlines and to meet goals. So changes like that are normal, and in fact I can think of other examples as well, like Zunisha showing up to the entrance of Wano only to end up walking away. Also, at one point near the ending of the third act of Wano, we saw Rob Lucci saying that it was important to capture Nico Robin. there was like a fleet of government ships that were approaching Wano. But by the end, it turns out that that whole capture Nico Robin plotline didn't really lead anywhere either. And then again, I also think that Yamato not joining the crew, or us not getting another final Straw Hat member, that was also one of the changes that took place. And Aokiji being the 10th captain was a consequence of that as well. Because again, I think that Aokiji was always supposed to be an ally, or pretend to be an ally to the Blackbeard pirates, but not an actual crewmate. And speaking of things that were cut from the final version of the story, or things that died in editing, I was pleasantly surprised as I was doing research for this video. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that originally Yamato was supposed to have 3 eyes. So Yamato was supposed to be like pudding, essentially, at least according to Road to Laugh Tale Volume 3. So I really thought that was fascinating, because if we go along with that idea of Yamato being a descendant of the Three-Eyed Clan, as well as having the Oni blood, right, or having those Oni horns like Kaido, then that would mean that originally Oda was thinking about making Yamato's mom a member of the Three-Eyed Clan. And I actually really would have loved to have seen that, because Kaido getting together with a member of the Three-Eyed Clan makes so much sense for Kaido's character. Because if you remember, there were certain things that he would say during his fight against Yamato, where he would say like, you know, oh, humans and Oni, they'll never be able to understand each other. Like, Oni will never be accepted by man. I think he tells Yamato, the samurai are not your friends. You know, the samurai at the end of the day, they're different from us because we're Oni. They're just intimidated by our strength. So the fact that Kaido found somebody from the Three-Eyed Clan, which we know has also experienced a lot of prejudice, you know, from Pudding's backstory, how she never felt accepted even within her own family. And so I think that would have been a perfect way to humanize Kaido, the fact that Kaido as an Oni got together with somebody who belonged to another race that has also experienced a lot of discrimination. And so again, if we go back to the drawing board and we look at that plot line of the government showing up in Wano and saying that they wanted to kidnap, capture Nico Robin, and how that never went anywhere, it does get me to wonder, like, was Oda thinking about the government kidnapping Robin, taking her away, maybe doing something with her so that she doesn't die, but she gets, you know, sort of indisposed where she can't read the poneglyphs, and then maybe Yamato was supposed to join the Straw Hats, and then the Three-Eyed Power was going to help the Straw Hats in deciphering the poneglyphs to move the story forward? Because I think that could have been a possibility. And on a related note, we don't get to see Pudding in this chapter. The last time we saw her, she was aboard one of Blackbeard's ships, and the ship was off the coast of Winter Island, and I don't think we get to see a ship in this chapter. And we also know that the 3 islands of Elbaf, Egghead, and Winter Island are relatively close together, so it might be likely that Pudding is actually aboard the ship that we saw heading to Egghead. So maybe her and Sanji will be reuniting very soon. And so that is going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching and for supporting the videos and the channel. Thank you very much. If you would like to, you can follow me on Instagram at Team7Mage. As always, let me know what you thought about the points that I raised in the video. Take care, have a great week, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.